February 12, 1943, Luftwaffe base Morozovskaya, 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Oberst Heinrich Müller stood at the head of a smoke-filled briefing room, examining the sleep-deprived faces of his most experienced night fighter pilots. For 17 consecutive nights, Soviet bombers had disrupted operations, destroyed ammunition stockpiles, and turned sleep into a luxury no one could afford. The temperature outside hovered at minus 30 degrees, but inside the heated command post, frustration ran hotter. Mueller had called this emergency briefing not to devise new tactics, but to address what he considered a humiliation. His pilots were being terrorized by women flying crop dusters. "Gentlemen, let me ensure I understand our predicament correctly," Miller began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The enemy opposing us consists of Soviet girls, flying training biplanes constructed in 1928, built from plywood and fabric, powered by engines weaker than most automobiles. These are not combat aircraft. These are machines designed to teach farm boys how to fly before giving them real airplanes. And yet, night after night, we cannot stop them." Hauptmann Werner Schmidt lit a cigarette and laughed. "Herr Oberst, my grandmother could shoot down a POW too. The damn things fly slower than our fighters can maintain altitude. Give us one clear night, proper visibility, and we'll eliminate this embarrassment before breakfast." The room erupted in agreement. Officers raised schnapps glasses in mock toasts to the flying kindergarten and Stalin's desperation. Mueller himself smiled, confident that German engineering superiority and pilot skill would resolve this irritation within days. The Night Witches, as Soviet propaganda called them, were nothing more than psychological theater, a desperate measure by a collapsing enemy. What Oberst Mueller didn't know was that at that precise moment, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova was already airborne 8 kilometers from his base, piloting her POW-2 through the frozen darkness at 94 miles per hour. The 21-year-old navigator's daughter from Ukraine had just completed her third bombing run of the night and was returning for her fourth. This sortie would be number 218 of what would eventually become 852 missions, part of a collective total of 24,000 runs that the 40 women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment would fly before war's end. Popova had already dropped 4 tons of bombs that month alone, survived being shot down twice, and accumulated 17 bullet holes in her canvas fuselage from her most recent encounter with German fighters. Less than 48 hours after Muller's confident briefing, Popova's regiment would destroy the ammunition depot at Morozovskaya, killing 14 personnel and creating secondary explosions that burned for 3 days. The explosion would be visible from Muller's command post window. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the culmination of brutal lessons purchased with blood across multiple theaters. After the Battle of Britain, where 73 Luftwaffe pilots froze to death in open cockpits during winter channel patrols, Germany mandated enclosed, heated crew compartments for all night fighters. Operation Barbarossa's first winter killed another 42 pilots in mid-air collisions due to poor coordination, resulting in mandatory radio equipment installation across the entire night fighter fleet. A comprehensive 1941 casualty analysis revealed that 30% of night fighter losses were preventable deaths from aircraft damage that would have been survivable with parachutes, leading to requirements that all night fighters operate at sufficient altitude for emergency bailouts. The Luftwaffe established a minimum operational speed of 180 miles per hour after discovering that slower aircraft became easy targets for Soviet ground fire. The Junkers Ju-88 embodied these requirements perfectly. 300 miles per hour, maximum speed, enclosed cockpit with heating for a crew of 4, Fuji 220 Liechtenstein radar for target acquisition, twin Junkers Yuma engines producing 2,400 horsepower combined. Between 1940 and 1942, Ju-88 night fighters destroyed 357 British bombers over occupied Europe. German confidence wasn't arrogance. It was earned through technological superiority and demonstrated combat effectiveness. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On the night of January 8, 1943, she flew 7 missions against the German supply depot at Tatsinskaya. Her PO-2 had no radio whatsoever, requiring her navigator Katya Ryabova to communicate through hand signals and shouted instructions that were barely audible over wind noise. Neither woman carried a parachute because the PO-2's operational altitude of 400 meters made bailout survival impossible regardless. Popova's aircraft had no heating system, causing her breath to freeze instantly into ice crystals that accumulated on her goggles, forcing her to remove them periodically despite the -40-degree wind chill. Her maximum speed of 94 miles per hour meant German fighters roared past at more than 3 times her velocity. Yet she completed all 7 bombing runs successfully, destroying 2 supply trucks and starting fires that consumed an estimated 40 tons of materiel. This was mission 193 of what would eventually become 852, a personal contribution to the regiment's collective 24,000 runs that German intelligence dismissed as statistically impossible. The German quartermaster at Tatsinskaya recorded the losses as unexplained fires of unknown origin, because accepting that wooden biplanes had penetrated their defenses seemed less plausible than spontaneous combustion. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established over 4 years of aerial warfare. The Polikarpov PO-2 was constructed from plywood frames covered in canvas fabric, creating what German pilots called flying kindling, or plywood with wings. A single incendiary round could theoretically ignite the entire aircraft instantly. The open cockpit design exposed pilots to Siberian winter conditions that regularly reached -40 degrees Celsius, causing severe frostbite that left many night witches with permanently damaged fingers and faces. Their breath formed ice on eyelashes that had to be manually broken off to maintain visibility. The PO-2 carried no radio equipment, making coordination impossible beyond pre-mission briefings. Navigation relied entirely on visual landmarks and dead reckoning. Pilots received no parachutes because the aircraft's low operational altitude made them useless weight. No armor plating protected crew members from ground fire or fighter attacks. The specifications read like a deliberate joke compared to German standards. Maximum speed of 94 miles per hour versus the Ju-88's 300. A single 100 horsepower M11 5-cylinder radial engine versus the Ju-88's 2,400 combined horsepower. Aircraft design, dating to 1928, making the PO-2 older than most pilots flying them. Production cost, approximately $5,000 per unit, compared to the Ju-88's $80,000, with assembly time of 3 weeks versus 3 months. The Soviet strategy appeared to be sending women into combat, flying wooden training aircraft converted to bombers through the addition of bomb racks under the wings, with explosives hand-dropped by the navigator, using a stopwatch and visual estimation. German intelligence analysts struggled to classify the PO-2 as a legitimate military threat. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into tactical advantages that German doctrine couldn't counter. The PO-2's primitive construction and rapid production meant that when Popova's aircraft was damaged beyond repair during a forced landing on March 4, 1943, she received a replacement aircraft within 18 hours. German pilots waiting for repaired Ju-88s measured downtime in weeks. The wooden and canvas construction that seemed so vulnerable actually created a bizarre defensive advantage. Bullets passed through fabric without finding critical systems to destroy. During a mission on February 23, 1943, Popova's aircraft absorbed 24 bullet holes from a German fighter's cannon fire, The rounds punched through canvas, missed the engine by centimeters, and exited the opposite side without causing catastrophic damage. She flew the perforated aircraft back to base, landed successfully, and was airborne again in a patched PO-2 within 4 hours. If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, Popova later told a war correspondent, that bullet would have ricocheted inside the fuselage until it found me or something vital. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours. The PO-2's simple design meant refueling took 4 minutes and reloading bombs took 3, enabling Popova to fly 8 to 12 missions per night, while German bombers typically managed 2 or 3. This rapid turnaround capability was impossible to achieve with complex, heavily equipped German aircraft that required extensive pre-flight checks and longer ground servicing. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment dated March 15, 1943, concluded, Soviet deployment of female pilots operating obsolete PO-2 training aircraft in combat roles represents a desperate measure indicative of severe pilot shortages and declining manufacturing capacity. The aircraft's wooden construction and primitive equipment render it extremely vulnerable to modern air defense systems and fighter interception. Physics remains immutable. Speed, metal construction, and modern equipment invariably defeat slow, wooden, obsolete aircraft. Current operations are predicted to cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates. Mathematical analysis confirms decisive German advantages: 3.2 to 1 speed ratio, 24 to 1 horsepower differential, 16 to 1 cost efficiency, favoring German rapid replacement of losses. Assessment: temporary morale, impact through sleep disruption only. No serious operational threat to German military objectives. Recommendation: monitor situation, but do not prioritize development of special countermeasures or divert resources from primary threats. The assessment carried the full authority of the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure. On March 18, 1943, 3 days after the official assessment declared the Night Witches operationally irrelevant, Popova led a 6-aircraft formation against an ammunition train stationed near Krimskaya. Her bombs struck the locomotive directly, causing the train's cargo of artillery shells to detonate in a chain reaction that destroyed 4 kilometers of rail line and killed an estimated 60 German personnel. By this point in her career, she had conducted over 240 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 total that would make her one of the most decorated Soviet pilots while contributing to the regiment's collective 24,000 runs. German logistics officers recorded unexplainable losses at rates that contradicted the Luftwaffe's technical assessment, but the reports never reached officials willing to challenge the established doctrine. Accepting that women in wooden biplanes were degrading German combat effectiveness required admitting that 4 years of aerial warfare doctrine had overlooked a fundamental vulnerability. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error, and the mathematics that damned them appeared deceptively simple. Their logic seemed unassailable. The Ju-88 cruising at 300 miles per hour versus the PO-2's maximum of 94 miles per hour created a 3.2 to 1 speed advantage. Basic interception geometry suggested easy target acquisition and destruction. What German engineers critically overlooked was that interception requires matching the target's speed, not merely exceeding it. Fighter aircraft cannot simply fly past targets at maximum velocity and expect to achieve weapons lock. They must reduce speed to maintain position for effective engagement. The aerodynamic paradox that destroyed German night fighter effectiveness was stall speed. The Ju-88 stalled at approximately 120 miles per hour, meaning the aircraft fell from the sky if velocity dropped below that threshold. The PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour, and could glide at 60 miles per hour with the engine throttled to idle. The Night Witches flew below the German minimum survivable speed. This created an impossible engagement scenario. German pilots approaching at combat speed overshot targets too quickly for weapons acquisition, but slowing to engagement speed brought them dangerously close to catastrophic stall conditions. No middle ground existed. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted to intercept a PO-2 by reducing his Ju-88 speed to 130 miles per hour. The Soviet pilot immediately throttled her engine to idle and descended into a 60-mile-per-hour glide. Schmidt's aircraft showed stall warnings, his wings beginning to wobble, as airflow over the control surfaces became insufficient to maintain stable flight. He was forced to abort the engagement and apply full power to recover altitude. His official report stated, "Target speed below minimum engagement threshold. Interception impossible without risking aircraft loss." The mathematics that gave Germans confidence had betrayed them. Faster was not always better. Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable when she chose to be. On April 9, 1943, during what would be her 6th sortie of the night, Popova detected a German fighter approaching from her navigator's shouted warning. She immediately throttled her engine to minimum power and descended to treetop altitude at 70 miles per hour. The German pilot made 4 passes at her aircraft. Each time he approached from behind, building speed to close the distance, he overshot by hundreds of meters before he could achieve firing position. On his final attempt, the German reduced speed aggressively, trying to match Popova's velocity. His aircraft's wings began wobbling visibly, the characteristic sign of approaching stall speed. Rather than risk crashing, he was forced to abandon the engagement or die. Popova continued to her target, dropped her bombs successfully, and returned to base without damage. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions and multiplied across the regiment's 24,000 total runs, proved the PO-2's slowness was its greatest weapon. Speed had always been considered the primary advantage in aerial combat, the determining factor in every engagement calculation since the First World War. The Night Witches demonstrated that assumptions built into doctrine for decades could be rendered obsolete by an adversary willing to fight outside established parameters. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed, and Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots like Hauptmann Schmidt was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed. The Luftwaffe had optimized its entire night fighter force to intercept fast Soviet bombers like the Ilyushin Il-4 and Petlyakov Pa-2, both cruising above 250 miles per hour. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 were designed to pursue and destroy these targets through superior speed and firepower. Their pilots trained extensively in high-speed pursuit tactics, learning to anticipate target movements and achieve weapons lock during brief engagement windows. But these tactics assumed the enemy would attempt to escape by flying faster, not slower. The physics were unforgiving. Aircraft must maintain minimum airspeed to generate sufficient lift over the wings, or they fall from the sky. A Ju-88, cruising at 300 miles per hour, could overtake any target. But slowing to engage required reducing speed to approximately 150 miles per hour, dangerously close to the 120 mile per hour stall threshold. The PO-2 operating at 80 miles per hour and capable of gliding at 60 miles per hour existed in an untouchable zone below German fighter capability. At a speed differential of 200 miles per hour or more, target acquisition lasted approximately 2 to 3 seconds before the German fighter overshot. Achieving radar lock, visual confirmation, and weapons firing solution in that window proved impossible. German pilots found themselves in the absurd position of flying too fast to fight targets, flying too slow to escape. On April 22, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 273rd mission. Approaching a German artillery position near Taman Peninsula at 0230 hours, she detected a Bf-110 by the distinctive sound of its twin engines cutting through the night. Her navigator, Katya Ryabova, tapped her shoulder and pointed at the fighter's silhouette crossing the moon. Popova's immediate response was to throttle her engine to minimum power, reducing airspeed to approximately 65 miles per hour. The German pilot made 4 separate attack runs. On the first pass, he approached from behind, at combat speed, and overshot by nearly a kilometer before he could even acquire her in his gun sight. His second attempt was slower, but at 160 miles per hour he still screamed past before achieving firing position. The third pass brought him dangerously slow, and Popova could see his wings wobbling as he approached stall conditions, forcing him to abort and apply full throttle. On his fourth attempt, the pilot tried a head-on approach, but Popova's minimal speed meant he crossed her position in less than 2 seconds with no opportunity to fire. Each failed pass gave Popova time to adjust her course back toward the target. She completed her bombing run while the German fighter circled helplessly, burning fuel in frustration. This tactic, perfected over what would eventually become 852 missions contributing to the regiment's collective 24,000 runs, transformed the PO-2's slowness from vulnerability into invulnerability. When she landed, Popova's official report stated simply, "Target destroyed, enemy fighter encountered, evasion successful." The German pilot's report acknowledged, "Target sighted but interception impossible due to insufficient engagement speed." The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO-2's greatest vulnerability, its canvas and wood construction. German fighter ammunition was engineered specifically for metal aircraft. When a bullet struck an aluminum fuselage, it penetrated the skin, created metal shrapnel fragments from the entry hole, and ricocheted inside the enclosed space until striking fuel lines, hydraulic systems, oxygen tanks, electrical wiring, or crew members. Armor-piercing rounds delivered maximum energy, penetrating armor plating that didn't exist on PO-2s. Incendiary tracers were designed to ignite aviation fuel stored in metal tanks. Explosive rounds detonated on contact with hard surfaces, creating lethal fragmentation. But canvas aircraft physics worked differently. A bullet-striking fabric simply passed through, creating a clean hole as it entered and exited without transferring significant energy. The canvas tore, but didn't fragment or shatter. Wood frames absorbed bullets by making clean holes unless the round struck a structural spar directly, and even then, the damage was localized. The vital systems that bullets needed to hit, the engine, fuel tank, and 2-person crew, occupied perhaps 5% of the aircraft's total volume. The remaining 95% was empty space surrounded by fabric. Canvas tiers didn't significantly affect aerodynamics because the tight weave and doping compound maintained structural integrity around punctures. Repairs required minutes rather than hours. Ground crews patched bullet holes with fabric glue and fresh canvas, while metal aircraft required welding equipment, replacement panels, and structural certification. German pilots consistently reported scoring hits but achieving no kills, describing bullets passing through without effect, a phenomenon their training had never addressed. During her mission on May 7, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively when she encountered sustained fire from a German Flak 38 anti-aircraft gun while attacking a supply convoy. The 20mm rounds were designed to shred metal bombers, and the German gunner tracked her PO-2 with devastating accuracy. Ground crew inspection after landing counted 42 bullet holes distributed across her aircraft. 27 holes perforated the upper wing alone, creating a constellation pattern visible against sunlight. 11 rounds passed through the fuselage between where Popova sat in the front cockpit and where Ryabova occupied the rear position. 3 bullets tore through the tail assembly. 1 round passed within 15 centimeters of Popova's head, close enough that she felt the pressure wave as it went by. The ground crew chief stood in stunned silence, examining the damage, tracing his fingers through holes while shaking his head. Yet every bullet had passed through canvas and exited cleanly. Not one had struck the engine, penetrated the fuel tank, or hit either crew member. The aircraft was deemed airworthy after rapid patching with fabric and glue. Popova flew 3 more missions that night in the same damaged aircraft before it was retired for more extensive repairs. By the time the POW-2 was returned to service 2 days later, it had carried her through 50 additional missions. When asked by a war correspondent how she survived, Popova responded, "In their metal planes, I would be dead. Their bullets look for vital systems to destroy. In canvas, there's nothing for them to find. Germans built aircraft to protect their pilots. We built aircraft bullets could ignore." But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale, transforming the Night Witches from tactical nuisance into psychological weapon. German searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied fundamentally on acoustic detection for initial target acquisition. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to provide approximate location and bearing, allowing searchlight operators to illuminate that section of sky while anti-air aircraft gunners prepared firing solutions. The standard defensive sequence began with acoustic detection. Soldiers heard approaching engines, activated searchlights, directed anti-aircraft fire, and scrambled fighters to intercept. The Night Witches discovered, possibly by accident initially, then refined into doctrine, that the POW-2's excellent glide ratio created an acoustic exploitation opportunity. The tactic worked in 5 precise steps. First, approach the target at 8,000 feet with engine at full throttle, making maximum noise to ensure Germans heard the threat and prepared defenses. Second, at 3,000 feet altitude and approximately 6 miles from target, cut the engine to complete idle. Third, glide in total silence for 5 to 6 minutes, covering the remaining distance with no sound beyond wind rushing through canvas wings. Fourth, release bombs before Germans realized aircraft were directly overhead. Fifth, restart the engine only after bombs exploded. The physics enabled this. The PO-2's glide ratio of approximately 1 to 10 meant losing 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward travel. From 3,000 feet, the aircraft could glide 30,000 feet, nearly 6 miles, before requiring engine power. At a glide speed of 60 miles per hour, this silent approach lasted 5 to 6 minutes. The only sound was wind through fabric, a soft rustling completely unlike engine roar and impossible to locate acoustically. The psychological effect was devastating. Germans heard engines approaching, prepared defenses, then heard nothing, saw nothing, and suddenly experienced explosions from directly overhead. On the night of June 4th, 1943, the same night she would complete 8 missions contributing to what would eventually become her 852, Nadezhda Popova used this silent approach on her 7th sortie. The target was a German command post controlling artillery batteries near Novorossiysk. She approached with her engine at full throttle, and German searchlights activated immediately, sweeping the sky while anti-aircraft guns prepared to fire. At 2,800 feet altitude, she cut her engine completely. The PO-2 fell silent and began its glide directly toward the German position below. In the sudden quiet, she could actually hear German soldiers calling to each other, their voices carrying up through the night air. "Wo sind die Flugzeuge? Ich höre nichts." Where are the planes? I hear nothing. Searchlight beams swept empty sky in increasingly frantic patterns. She glided over their positions at 400 feet altitude, low enough that she could see their faces illuminated by their own searchlights as they looked up. Searching for aircraft they could hear minutes ago, but could no longer find. She released her bombs at 350 feet. The explosions illuminated German soldiers in mid-search. Flashbulbs capturing their faces turned skyward toward nothing. Only after clearing the target area and beginning her turn back to base did she restart the engine. The sudden sound must have seemed like mockery. She would repeat this silent approach across the 24,000 collective runs the regiment would fly. But that particular night, completing 8 missions, proved the tactic's psychological power. As she told Ryabova during their brief refueling stop, "We are ghosts they cannot fight. They fear the silence more than the bombs, because silence means we control when they die." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality, and the statistical comparison revealed advantages that specifications couldn't predict. The Junkers Ju-88 embodied impressive engineering, maximum speed of 300 miles per hour, twin engines producing 2,400 horsepower combined, Fuji 220 Liechtenstein radar for target acquisition, radio equipment enabling crew coordination, armor plating, protecting vital systems, and a crew of 4 specialists sharing workload and decision-making. Manufacturing each aircraft cost $80,000 and required 3 months of skilled labor, using precision manufacturing techniques. But operational tempo exposed the contradiction between capability and effectiveness. A Ju-88 night fighter flew 1 to 2 sorties per night maximum. Between missions, maintenance required 3 to 4 hours for comprehensive systems checks, refueling, rearming, and mandatory crew rest. 4 men coordinating in high-stress combat environments needed time to debrief, analyze mission data, and prepare mentally for the next sortie. The average Ju-88 night fighter career lasted 40 to 60 missions before the aircraft was lost to enemy action, mechanical failure, or crew rotation. Survival rates hovered around 60%, with many losses attributed to weather navigation errors and mechanical failures rather than combat. The sophistication that made the Ju-88 formidable also made it fragile. The POW-2 inverted every assumption. Its specifications appeared primitive. Maximum speed 94 miles per hour, single engine producing 100 horsepower, no radar, no radio, no armor, and a crew of just 2 women. Manufacturing cost $5,000 with production completed in 3 weeks using minimal skilled labor. But operational tempo revealed unexpected superiority. A POW-2 crew flew 8 to 18 sorties per night routinely. Maintenance between missions required 7 minutes total, 4 minutes for refueling, and 3 minutes for reloading bombs. Ground crews could prepare an aircraft faster than the pilot could walk from debriefing to her cockpit. 2 women who had flown together for hundreds of missions achieved coordination through experience that eliminated the need for radio communication. Hand signals and shouted instructions over wind noise proved sufficient. The average Night Witch career exceeded 800 missions, with some pilots surpassing 1,000. Survival rates reached 96.8%, with losses almost entirely from ground fire rather than fighter interception. The paradox was absolute. More expensive, sophisticated aircraft delivered lower operational effectiveness, while simpler, cheaper aircraft delivered higher operational effectiveness. German advantages in technology became disadvantages in logistics. Building one Ju-88 consumed resources that could produce 16 PO2s. Training one 4-man Ju-88 crew required resources that could train 8 PO2 crews. Each Night Witch pair flew more missions in 1 week than a Ju-88 crew flew in 1 month. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record. On the night of June 4, 1943, when she completed 8 missions between 2200 hours and 5530 hours. Each complete cycle, flying to target, bombing, returning to base, refueling, reloading, and launching again, averaged 25 minutes. Her ground crew achieved such efficiency that mechanics prepared her aircraft faster than she could complete her brief debriefing and walk back to the flight line. That night, she dropped 240 kilograms of bombs total across 8 targets. German positions hit included 2 ammunition dumps, 1 vehicle park, 1 command post, 3 artillery batteries, and 1 supply depot. German casualties were estimated at 37 personnel killed and dozens wounded. Infrastructure damage included 12 vehicles destroyed, 2 artillery pieces rendered inoperable, and 1 entire battalion's ammunition supply detonated. For comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot rarely exceeded 4 sorties in one night, and only under exceptional circumstances. By this point in the war, Popova's mission count approaching 300 of her eventual 852 was becoming legendary, even among German soldiers who privately acknowledged that attempts to stop her were futile. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing patterns that revealed economic warfare more devastating than tactical victory. German expenditure attempting to stop the Night Witches specifically demonstrated resource allocation catastrophically disproportionate to the threat's cost. Anti-aircraft artillery units fired more than 2 million rounds at Night Witches over the course of their operations. At 50 Reichsmarks per high explosive shell, this represented 100 million Reichsmarks, approximately 40 million US dollars, in ammunition alone. Dedicated fighter intercept attempts exceeded 1,000 sorties. At 500 Reichsmarks operational cost per sortie, accounting for fuel, maintenance, and pilot compensation, this added another 500,000 Reichsmarks. 200 searchlight batteries were deployed specifically for night defense against harassment raids. 5,000 soldiers were assigned to manning anti-aircraft positions, searchlight operations, and rapid response units dedicated to countering night attacks. Accounting for personnel costs, equipment depreciation, and operational overhead, total German expenditure exceeded 50 million Reichsmarks attempting to counter the Night Witches. Soviet investment in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment consisted of 40 PO2 aircraft at $5,000, each totaling $200,000. Ammunition costs representing a fraction of the defensive ammunition fired against them, and personnel numbering 80 pilots and navigators, plus minimal ground crew, totaling approximately 150 people. Total Soviet cost remained under 2 million US dollars for the entire regiment's war service. The cost ratio was devastating. Germans were spending 25 times more trying to stop what the Soviets spent creating it. The effectiveness ratio was worse. Germans achieved 0 confirmed fighter kills on Night Witches throughout the war. The result represented perfect asymmetric warfare. Minimal investment producing maximum enemy resource drain, while accomplishing genuine military objectives. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency in calculations that revealed individual strategic impact. If German anti-aircraft units fired an average of 1,000 rounds attempting to hit her per mission, a conservative estimate based on post-battle ammunition consumption reports, her 852 missions meant approximately 850,000 rounds fired at one woman. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, this represented 42 million Reichsmarks spent trying to kill a 21-year-old navigator's daughter from Ukraine. The result? She survived. Her bombs destroyed an estimated 120 tons of German ammunition, 73 vehicles, 42 artillery pieces, 17 supply depots, and infrastructure whose value German quartermaster records assessed at over 60 million Reichsmarks. The comparison was stark. Germans spent 42 million trying to stop damage valued at 60 million, creating a negative return on defensive investment. For context, the average United States Army Air Force's bomber crew rotated home after completing 25 missions. Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours of duty. She represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters accumulated in their operational lifetimes. Her 852 missions contributing to the regiment's 24,000 total runs made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal, delivering strategic impact that conventional metrics couldn't capture. German High Command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets, and Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would force Wehrmacht leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. On November 3, 1942, near Krimskaya in the Kuban region, a Polikarpov PO-2 suffered catastrophic engine failure during approach to its target. The pilot attempted an emergency landing in a clearing 3 kilometers behind German lines, but the aircraft struck trees during descent and crashed. German infantry from the 198th Division reached the wreckage within 20 minutes, expecting to capture or identify dead Soviet pilots. 2 crew members had survived the impact with minor injuries and were immediately taken prisoner. The interrogation officer, Hauptmann Franz Weber, anticipated routine questioning of male Soviet airmen. When guards removed the prisoners' leather flight helmets, Weber stopped mid-sentence. Before him stood 2 young women, Lieutenant Yevdokia Nosal, age 22, and her navigator Corporal Irina Sabrova, age 20. Weber's initial assumption was that these were transport pilots, or perhaps instructors caught behind lines during evacuation. Standard interrogation procedure required documentation search, and German soldiers recovered the women's flight logs from the wrecked aircraft. Nozel's logbook showed 354 missions conducted over 18 months. Sabrova's showed 312. Weber's official report, filed the following morning, stated, prisoners identified as Lieutenant Yevdokia Nosal and Corporal Irina Sabrova, 588th Night Bomber Regiment, both female, ages 22 and 20 respectively, have conducted 354 and 312 combat missions as documented in recovered flight logs. Prisoners display no fear, remain defiant when questioned, claim their entire regiment consists exclusively of female personnel operating PO-2 aircraft in night harassment bombing role. Initially considered this statement to be disinformation intended to confuse intelligence assessment, but consistency between prisoner testimony and documentation found aboard crashed aircraft suggests information may be accurate. Request immediate verification through higher intelligence channels. The report reached Battalion Commander Oberst Kurt Steiner within hours. Steiner's initial response dismissed the claim as Soviet propaganda or clerical error. Female pilots might ferry aircraft or serve as instructors, but combat operations seemed implausible given Soviet military doctrine and the physical demands of repeated night missions in sub-zero temperatures. However, 3 additional confirmations arrived that same week from separate sectors along the front. A captured Soviet airfield at Maikop yielded personnel rosters showing unmistakably female names assigned to combat squadrons. A second PO-2 shot down near Novorossiysk revealed another female pilot's body. Documents recovered from an abandoned Soviet command post included awards, citations specifically noting female pilot-navigator pairs. Steiner escalated the reports to division level, then corps, then Army group. Each command level exhibited the same pattern: initial disbelief, followed by grudging acceptance as evidence accumulated. Wehrmacht intelligence conducted systematic analysis and confirmed the 588th Night Bomber Regiment's existence as an all-female combat unit operational since May 1942. On November 18, 1942, General Major Wilhelm Hasse presented findings to assembled senior officers at Army Group South Headquarters. The briefing room filled with commanders responsible for defending against nightly raids that had cost millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of tons of destroyed materiel. Hasse displayed intelligence photographs, captured documents, and prisoner testimonies. He showed aircraft serial numbers appearing in multiple raid reports across 6 months. Cross-referenced records demonstrated these same aircraft had conducted hundreds of missions. The conclusion was unavoidable and humiliating. Women were personally responsible for the harassment campaign that had degraded Wehrmacht combat effectiveness and consumed enormous defensive resources attempting to stop them. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Initial disbelief persisted among many officers who demanded additional verification despite overwhelming evidence. The psychological impact cut deeper than operational concerns. Elite Luftwaffe pilots trained for years to master complex aircraft and modern aerial warfare doctrine had been systematically defeated by women flying wooden training biplanes designed before most of those pilots were born. The propaganda implications were catastrophic. How could Wehrmacht High Command explain to the German public that their invincible military machine was being terrorized nightly by Soviet girls? The ideological conflict proved even more problematic. Nazi doctrines specifically relegated women to domestic roles supporting male warriors. Operational reality demonstrated that Soviet women were not merely fighting effectively, but achieving tactical success that German men with superior equipment could not prevent. The question haunted senior commanders. If women could accomplish this, what other fundamental assumptions about Soviet military capability were wrong? Specific reactions varied by rank and position. Luftwaffe fighter pilots quietly requested transfers to other theaters, rather than admit being bested by female adversaries. Some officers insisted on bureaucratic evasion, referring to Soviet night harassment units in official correspondence to avoid acknowledging gender in combat reports. Luftwaffe High Command actively suppressed information distribution, fearing the morale impact if frontline troops learned the truth. Frontline soldiers' reactions differed significantly from officer corps. Among infantry and artillery units actually experiencing the nightly attacks, grudging respect mixed with genuine fear. The nickname Nachthexen, night witches, spread rapidly through German positions despite official discouragement of the term. Some units began specifically requesting dedicated anti-night witch defensive resources. Others refused to acknowledge gender entirely, focusing only on the tactical threat and treating the pilots as they would any effective enemy. Operational Order 4427, issued December 2, 1942, from Luftwaffe High Command, stated, "All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender composition. This directive is issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale or provide propaganda advantage to the enemy." While German command struggled with the revelation, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause or awareness that her existence had become a command-level crisis. On November 3, 1942, the same day Weber interrogated Nosal and Sabrova, Popova was flying her 362nd mission, unaware that Germans had just confirmed what she had never considered noteworthy: her gender. She had never flown to prove women could fight. The question had never interested her. Fascist forces had invaded her homeland, killed her brother, destroyed her village. She flew to kill fascists. Whether Germans knew she was a woman made absolutely no difference to the bombs she dropped. On the night Germans confirmed her regiment's composition, she was attacking a German supply depot near Slavyansk. Her bombs destroyed 2 ammunition trucks and ignited a fuel storage facility that burned for 18 hours. By the time Wehrmacht intelligence finished their verification process in mid-November, Popova had already completed 379 of her eventual 852 missions, steadily contributing to the regiment's collective 24,000 runs that would make the 588th Night Bomber Regiment the most decorated female unit in Soviet military history. When asked years later whether learning that Germans were shocked by female pilots affected her, Popova responded simply, "We didn't fly to prove women could fight. We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs. They died the same either way." The discovery changed nothing operationally. German fighters still couldn't match POW speeds. German bullets still passed through canvas without finding vital systems. German soldiers still heard silence before explosions. The Night Witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from thousands of German prisoners during demobilization processing between 1945 and 1947. When interrogators specifically asked about Eastern Front experiences and night operations, an unexpected pattern emerged. Even hardened SS officers who showed indifference discussing brutal ground combat displayed visible reactions when the topic turned to the Night Witches. Consistency appeared across hundreds of separate interviews conducted in different camps by different interrogators. The testimonies revealed psychological impacts that operational reports had never captured. Oberleutnant Hans Richter, a U-88 night fighter pilot from Nachtjagdgeschwader 4, was captured near Berlin on May 1, 1945. His testimony recorded during June 1945 interrogation stated, "We received orders to intercept these aircraft beginning March 1943. Command didn't tell us they were women. We only learned this after the war ended when your interrogators informed us. I personally attempted interception 17 times between March 1943 and September 1944. 17 failures. Not one successful engagement. The aircraft flew too slow for effective interception. My stall warnings activated every single time I attempted to match their speed. If I slowed below 130 miles per hour, my Ju-88 became uncontrollable. They operated comfortably at 70 or 80. It was humiliating in ways I cannot adequately express. You train for years to master complex aircraft. You face British Lancaster bombers. You believe you understand air combat. Then a wooden biplane makes you appear incompetent. When I learned after surrender that they were women, I had no words. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't allow it. Gender was irrelevant to that equation. They had beaten the fundamental laws of aerodynamics itself." Hauptmann Georg Kraus commanded a Flak 38 anti-aircraft battery in eastern Ukraine from August 1942 through February 1944. His testimony provided different perspective. "My battery fired an estimated 43,000 rounds at these aircraft between August 1942 and our retreat in early 1944. We achieved perhaps 4 confirmed hits across 18 months. 4 hits from 43,000 rounds fired. They would approach with engines audible. We would prepare firing solutions, activate searchlights, then complete silence. We would fire at projected positions based on last known bearing, but we were shooting at empty sky. The engine sounds would return only after bombs had already exploded. One of my gunners suffered complete psychological breakdown in November 1943. He claimed he could hear them in silence, that they were inside his head. I had him removed from duty, but I understood what he meant. We all heard them in the silence. Learning post-war that they were women only added to the realization that we had fundamentally underestimated everything about this enemy. Gender didn't make them more or less effective. They were effective because they exploited vulnerabilities we didn't know existed in our doctrine. The pattern in testimonies revealed common themes that operational reports had obscured. Nearly every German who engaged Night Witches mentioned the psychological impact of silence. Failed interceptions due to speed differential appeared in almost every fighter pilot account. Universal shock characterized reactions to learning pilots were female. Many attempted rationalization. Some insisted Soviet propaganda had exaggerated female involvement, or that women served only as navigators while men piloted. Others admitted the truth more readily. Gender made no operational difference because the tactics were effective, regardless of who executed them. The phrase, "we couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed," appeared in variant forms across dozens of separate testimonies. Several mentioned specific night witches by reputation or aircraft markings rather than names, suggesting individual pilots had developed recognizable patterns that German defenders learned to identify. Almost all testimonies acknowledged that pre-war propaganda about Soviet inferiority and improvisation as weakness had been fundamentally wrong. The Night Witches had proven that technological simplicity combined with tactical innovation could defeat technological sophistication constrained by doctrinal rigidity. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name, until interrogators cross-referenced German records with Soviet documentation. Lieutenant Ernst Hoffmann, infantry company commander with the 111th Infantry Division, testified in August 1945. There was one particular aircraft we learned to recognize over our positions near Novorossiysk, and later during our retreat through Crimea. It had a distinctive pattern of canvas repair patches on both wings and fuselage, almost like a patchwork quilt. This aircraft appeared over our positions at least once weekly between December 1942 and April 1944. We began calling it the Ghost because it perfected the silent approach. I personally witnessed attacks from this aircraft 11 times. On February 23, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot with a direct hit, killing 14 men and creating explosions that lasted 3 days. On June 18, 1943, it struck our command post, killing our battalion commander and 3 staff officers. After the war, I learned from Soviet records provided during interrogation that this was likely Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova. Soviet documents indicate she flew over 852 missions during the war. 852. We never came close to shooting her down. Every attempt failed. She was effectively untouchable. Her 852 missions, including the night she flew 8 separate sorties, became documented not just in Soviet military records, but inadvertently in German testimonies from soldiers who had survived her attacks. Whether Popova knew Germans were being interrogated about her specifically remains unclear from available records. Her documented responses to post-war questions suggest she cared little about German perspectives or reactions. She had flown her missions, completed her duty, survived when many hadn't. German respect or humiliation or fear was their concern, not hers. Her focus had always been singular: victory. When asked to reflect on the impact the Night Witches had on German morale, Popova stated, "We did what needed doing. Whether they respected us or feared us or were humiliated by us was irrelevant. Our concern was destroying fascism." Their feelings about who was destroying them didn't change the outcome. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The Night Witches weren't anomalies or propaganda exaggerations. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 3 years earlier. She had completed 852 combat missions, more than any individual pilot, male or female, German or Soviet, flying comparable aircraft during the entire war. Her operational period spanned from the regiment's formation in May 1942 through the final German surrender, 36 months of nearly continuous night operations. Calculating conservatively at 2 hours per mission, including flight time to target and return, she logged over 1,700 flight hours in combat conditions. Each mission carried approximately 200 kilograms of bombs, meaning she personally delivered over 170 tons of explosives onto German positions. She survived the entire war without being shot down by enemy action, though she crashed twice due to mechanical failure and survived both incidents with minor injuries. The Soviet Union awarded her the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor, along with the Order of the Red Banner, Order of the Red Star, and multiple campaign medals. The physical toll was permanent. Severe frostbite from 3 winters of open cockpit flying left scars on her hands and face. Prolonged exposure to engine noise at close range caused partial hearing loss that would worsen with age. But the psychological resilience required to fly 852 missions, knowing each sortie could end in flames or capture, that every night might be the last, represented a dimension of courage that medals couldn't adequately recognize. The 588th Regiment lost 32 members killed during the war. Comrades Popova flew beside and mourned between missions before climbing back into her cockpit. Each of her 852 missions was flown with that knowledge. To understand the magnitude of these numbers, context matters profoundly. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40 to 60 missions during their entire careers before rotation, loss, or war's end. The United States Army Air Forces rotated bomber crews home after completing 25 missions, considering that sufficient combat exposure. By that standard, Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours of duty without rotation or relief. The average Soviet male bomber pilot flying conventional aircraft accumulated 150 to 300 missions. Popova's 852 exceeded even the regiment's internal average of 500 to 600 missions per pilot. She had flown more combat sorties than some entire bomber groups combined. If each mission averaged 2 hours from takeoff to landing, she spent 1,700 hours in combat flight time. If Germans fired an average of 1,000 anti-aircraft rounds attempting to hit her per mission, based on ammunition consumption reports from sectors she operated in, approximately 850,000 rounds were fired specifically at her aircraft. At 50 Reichsmarks per shell, that represented 42 million Reichsmarks expended trying to kill one woman. She survived. Her bombs destroyed estimated German material, valued at over 60 million Reichsmarks, according to Wehrmacht, quartermaster damage assessments cross-referenced with her mission reports. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history. And she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to deploy women in combat roles despite considerable internal opposition. The regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties between May 1942 and May 1945, delivering over 3,000 tons of bombs onto German positions across the Eastern Front. Conservative estimates based on German casualty reports and damage assessments suggest the Night Witches inflicted 5,000 German casualties killed or wounded, destroyed hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, and countless installations including command posts, supply depots, and artillery positions. The regiment operated continuously for 3 years without significant operational pauses. From approximately 80 personnel, 40 pilot-navigator pairs plus ground crew, 32 were killed in action, yielding a 96.8% survival rate. Conventional Soviet bomber units flying Il-4 and P-2 aircraft suffered 40 to 60% survival rates. The cost-effectiveness calculation was remarkable. The entire regiment cost approximately $2 million to equip, train, and maintain throughout the war. The estimated value of German material destroyed exceeded $50 million. German expenditure attempting to counter the night witches, anti-aircraft ammunition, fighter sorties, searchlight batteries, personnel costs, exceeded 125 million Reichsmarks. The cost ratio was approximately 1 to 60. For every dollar the Soviets invested, Germans spent 60 attempting to stop what that dollar created. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of night witches during the entire war. Almost all regiment losses resulted from ground fire, not air combat, validating the fundamental advantage the stall speed paradox provided. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value the night witches delivered beyond the material damage their bombs inflicted. The psychological warfare component degraded German combat effectiveness in ways traditional metrics couldn't measure. Sleep deprivation from nightly raids impaired decision-making, slowed reaction times, and created pervasive anxiety that affected entire units. Over 5,000 German soldiers were tied down in dedicated air defense roles attempting to counter 40 Soviet women, representing massive, inefficient resource allocation. Supply lines were disrupted, forcing Germans to use longer and more vulnerable routes to avoid known night witch operational areas, adding days to resupply operations. The propaganda value was incalculable. Proof that Soviet women could fight effectively against the Wehrmacht boosted morale throughout the Red Army and Soviet civilian population. The exposure of German miscalculation revealed fundamental flaws in Wehrmacht intelligence and doctrine that had broader implications beyond the night witches specifically. The regiment demonstrated an asymmetric warfare model that showed irregular tactics and minimal equipment could achieve strategic impact, disproportionate to investment. Marshal Georgy Zhukov reportedly noted in his memoirs, "The night witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers or resources. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them. This is the perfect definition of effective warfare." The 588th Regiment proved that in warfare, technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and determination can overcome engineering advantages. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle at individual scale. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced a different kind of challenge, returning to a world without nightly combat. Initial recognition came immediately. Parades through Moscow in summer 1945 celebrated the regiment's achievements. Official ceremonies awarded medals. Government speeches praised Soviet women's contributions to victory. But transitioning from 3 years of nightly life-or-death missions to civilian routine proved psychologically difficult. Popova struggled with the absence of purpose that flying provided, the sudden quiet of nights without engine noise, the loss of intense camaraderie formed through shared danger. She married fellow pilot Semyon Kharlamov in 1946 and remained in aviation, working as a flight instructor training the next generation of Soviet pilots. She maintained close relationships with surviving squadron mates, attending annual reunions where they honored fallen comrades. Recognition within the Soviet Union remained consistent through subsequent decades. Schools and streets were named after night witches. Museums featured their aircraft and stories. But Popova rarely spoke publicly about her missions, preferring private remembrance to public spectacle. She lived until 2013, dying at age 91, having outlived the German regime that had dismissed her as irrelevant by 68 years. For decades, the night witches remained virtually unknown in the West. Cold War tensions meant Soviet military achievements were either dismissed as propaganda or simply not reported in Western media. The 1980s glasnost period under Gorbachev allowed more stories to emerge from Soviet archives. Historians gained access to previously classified documents in the 1990s and began serious documentation of the 588th Regiment's operations. German testimonies from prisoner interrogations, declassified during this period, validated Soviet accounts and demonstrated this wasn't propaganda but documented historical fact. By the 2000s, researchers had compiled comprehensive records of individual pilots' missions, casualties, and achievements. Books appeared in English translation. Documentaries brought the story to Western audiences who had never heard of the Night Witches. The Russian Air Force Museum in Moscow featured a restored PO-2 alongside photographs and mission logs. Monuments were erected at former air bases. Films depicted their missions, though historical accuracy varied. Nadezhda Popova specifically received recognition as one of the most accomplished members, with her 852 missions cited in nearly every account of the regiment. Western military historians studying asymmetric warfare began using the Night Witches as a case study in effective tactics, overcoming technological disadvantage. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its specific historical moment to reveal universal principles about warfare, underestimation, and human determination. The tactical lessons are profound. Asymmetric approaches can defeat technological superiority when they exploit vulnerabilities that conventional doctrine doesn't address. The stall speed paradox the Night Witches exploited wasn't a secret of physics. It was a gap in German thinking that assumed faster always meant better. Psychological impact sometimes exceeds physical damage in strategic value. German sleep deprivation and morale degradation from nightly harassment arguably mattered more than the tonnage of bombs delivered. Innovation born from constraints matters more than abundant resources. The silent gliding approach existed because the PO-2 was primitive, not despite it. The lesson about underestimation cuts deepest. German assumptions about gender and aircraft primitiveness created blind spots that cost them millions in resources and thousands in casualties. Prejudice creates exploitable vulnerabilities because it prevents accurate threat assessment. What appears as weakness may actually be strength when viewed from different perspective. Canvas that couldn't stop bullets became an advantage when bullets passed through without finding systems to destroy. Dismissing any enemy based on preconceptions rather than capabilities is a fatal strategic error. The human dimension reveals something equally important. Flying 852 missions required extraordinary resilience that went beyond physical courage. Each mission carried the possibility of death or capture. The physical toll, frostbite, hearing loss, exhaustion, accumulated across 3 years. The psychological weight of losing 32 comrades while continuing to fly night after night demanded a kind of determination that doesn't fit comfortably into conventional narratives about heroism. Popova survived through a combination of skill, tactical intelligence, and probability that eventually failed 1 in 4 of her fellow pilots. She continued flying, knowing these odds. She restarted her engine and took off again hours after watching friends die. That represents a dimension of human will that numbers alone cannot capture. When Oberst Heinrich Müller stood in his briefing room in February 1943 and laughed at Soviet girls flying crop dusters, he made the same mistake Wehrmacht High Command would repeat throughout the war. He assumed his metrics of evaluation were the only metrics that mattered: speed, horsepower, metal construction, technological sophistication. These seemed like objective measurements of capability. What Müller couldn't comprehend was that Nadezhda Popova and her sisters weren't fighting the war he prepared for. They were fighting the war they could win. Her 852 missions weren't just sorties completing bombing objectives. They were proof that courage doesn't require the best equipment, that skill can overcome raw power, that physics itself becomes irrelevant when determination refuses to accept limitations that others consider absolute. In wooden biplanes that shouldn't have worked, against an enemy that refused to take them seriously until far too late. The Night Witches proved the most dangerous weapon isn't always the most powerful one. Sometimes it's the one your enemy never sees coming because they were too confident to look.